Hey, amazing viewers! Before we go into this riveting narrative, drop your location in the comments below. We love connecting with you all around the world. Also, if this is your first time here, press the subscribe button and join our incredible journey. Let's hit 10,000 subscribers this month together. Your support means everything. The Last Hug. It was supposed to be a day of quiet remembrance, a farewell wrapped in solemnity. Yet no one in the room could have predicted what was about to unfold. The dimly lit funeral home smelled of fresh lilies and melting wax, a mix of scents that clung to the air like a memory refusing to fade. The rows of wooden pews were filled with mourners draped in black, their faces cast down in grief. Some whispered prayers, others clutched tissues, dabbing at tears that refused to stop. At the front of the room, lying motionless in an elegant mahogany coffin, was Liam Thompson. A husband, a father, a man who had known struggle and sacrifice more intimately than most. His journey had been one of resilience, of clawing his way out of hardship with nothing but grit and sheer determination. Yet now he lay there in stillness, his once vibrant eyes closed forever, his lips, those that had once kissed his wife and whispered bedtime stories to his daughter, now pressed into an eternal silence. Among the crowd, a little girl barely 6 years old stood motionless beside her mother. Amy Thompson, Liam's only child, clutched a small stuffed bear to her chest. It was old and worn, its once bright fur now faded from years of being held too tightly on stormy nights. She had named it Poppy because that was what her father used to call her, his little poppy flower. Amy didn't cry like the adults around her. She just stood there, staring at her father's peaceful face with wide, unblinking eyes, as if waiting for him to wake up. Rachel, Liam's wife, knelt beside her, holding her daughter's hand with a grip so tight it left red marks on Amy's tiny fingers. Her own tears had dried into streaks on her cheeks, leaving behind an expression of exhaustion that no amount of sleep could ever fix. The priest's voice droned on in the background, speaking of life, of love, of heaven's embrace. But Amy wasn't listening. She barely understood the meaning of death. Her father had always told her that he would never leave her, that he would always be right beside her no matter what. So why wasn't he waking up? She took a hesitant step forward. The murmurs in the room hushed as Amy let go of her mother's hand and approached the coffin. Her small frame seemed even smaller against the grand casket that held the man who had been her entire world. Rachel whispered her name softly, a plea for her to come back, but Amy didn't stop. Her tiny fingers reached out, hesitating for just a moment before she placed them gently on Liam's cold hand. "Daddy." Her voice was barely a whisper, fragile like glass. The room fell into an eerie silence. Amy's breath hitched as she stared at his face, searching for any sign of movement. Her young heart refused to accept what everyone else had. So she did what she always did when she wanted her father's attention. She climbed into the coffin. Gasps erupted across the room. Some women let out soft cries of horror. A few men shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to intervene. Rachel shot forward, her heart nearly leaping out of her chest, but some invisible force, held her back. Amy carefully nestled herself against her father's still chest, just like she had every night before bed. "Daddy, wake up," she whispered into the fabric of his suit, her voice trembling. "It's not funny anymore. You promised me. You said you'd always be here." Tears finally welled up in her eyes, slipping down her cheeks and onto Liam's unmoving chest. "Please, Daddy," she sobbed. "Please wake up." Rachel couldn't hold back anymore. She rushed forward, her hands trembling as she reached for her daughter. "Amy, honey, come here." Daddy's resting now," she choked on her words. But before she could lift her, something happened that made the entire room freeze. Liam's fingers twitched. It was so slight, so imperceptible, that most would have dismissed it as a trick of the eye. But Amy felt it. Her breath hitched, and she pulled back slightly. The room was suffocatingly silent now, all eyes locked on the impossible sight before them. "Daddy," Amy whispered again. And then, it happened. Liam's chest rose, a shallow, barely their breath, but it was a breath nonetheless. The silence shattered. Rachel let out a strangled cry as gasps and shouts filled the room. The priest took a step back, his hands trembling as if he had just witnessed a miracle. Several mourners scrambled to their feet, knocking over chairs in their shock. Amy didn't move. She just stared at her father, her small hand still on his chest, feeling the unmistakable rhythm of a heartbeat. It was faint, it was weak, but it was there. Rachel stumbled backward, her mind struggling to process what was happening. This wasn't possible. Liam was gone. The doctors had declared him dead. There had been no signs of life for days. Yet here he was. Rachel let out a sob, covering her mouth as tears streamed down her face. Someone screamed for an ambulance. But Amy? She just smiled through her tears. "I knew you wouldn't leave me, Daddy," she whispered, resting her cheek against his chest. "I knew you'd come back." And for the first time since he had died, Liam's lips parted ever so slightly. A whisper of breath escaped, and with it, one word: Amy. A miracle that defied death. The world outside the funeral home had turned chaotic. The cold February wind howled through the trees, sending dried leaves scattering across the sidewalk. But inside, time had stopped. The man they had mourned just moments ago, the man whose life had been sealed inside a coffin, was breathing. His fingers, once lifeless and pale, twitched again. A gasp rippled through the room, a collective sound of disbelief mixed with raw, overwhelming hope. Rachel, standing just feet away, felt the air leave her lungs. She gripped the edge of a nearby pew to steady herself, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. She had spent the last 3 days crying over her husband, preparing herself to say goodbye forever. But now she was watching the impossible unfold. Amy, her small frame still curled up inside the coffin, never looked away from her father's face. Her tiny fingers pressed into the lapel of his dark suit, the fabric damp from her tears. She could feel it, the warmth returning to his body. Then Liam's lips moved again. The movement was slow, almost imperceptible, like someone fighting against an unseen force just to exist in the space between life and death. Amy. It was barely a whisper, a fragile sound that shattered the silence like thunder. Amy's heart soared. "Daddy," she gasped, her small hands gripping his arm, as if her touch alone could anchor him back to life. "Mommy." "He's talking." Rachel's legs nearly collapsed beneath her. A strangled sob tore from her throat, and she sprinted forward, pushing past the stunned mourners. "Liam." Her voice was a mix of fear and desperate hope. The priest, who had just been speaking about Liam's peaceful passage into heaven, clutched the Bible to his chest, as though it were the only thing keeping him grounded in reality. Some guests whispered fervent prayers, others backed away as if they had witnessed something divine, something unnatural. One woman, elderly and dressed in mourning black, whispered, "Saints above. I have never seen anything like this before." Rachel reached the coffin, her hands trembling as she pressed them against Liam's cheek, which just minutes ago had been cold as marble. Now there was warmth. His eyes fluttered open, revealing the same deep brown gaze that Rachel had fallen in love with all those years ago. But they were unfocused, distant, like someone waking from a dream they weren't supposed to return from. "Liam," she choked out, brushing the damp strands of hair from his forehead. "Oh my God, you're here. You're really here." Liam's lips parted again. He tried to speak, but his voice failed him, and instead, he let out a ragged, shaky breath. Then his eyes locked onto Amy, who was still cradled against his chest. His hand, weak and barely responsive, twitched toward her, as if reaching for something he had almost lost forever. "Baby," he rasped, his voice hoarse, his body trembling. I. And then, panic. Liam's body suddenly convulsed. Rachel screamed. "Somebody call an ambulance," Someone in the crowd shouted, snapping the room out of its frozen disbelief. The world exploded into movement. The guests, who had only moments ago been mourning, were now racing to save the man they had presumed dead, a man who had somehow fought his way back to life. Rachel grabbed Amy and pulled her away as Liam's body trembled violently, his chest rising and falling too fast. His fingers clawed at the air, like someone trying to hold on to something that was being ripped away from him. The funeral director, a stout man with gray hair, grabbed his phone and barked into it. "We need a paramedic at Willow Oak Chapel, immediately. The deceased, he's alive." The words felt surreal even as they left his mouth. Rachel held Amy tightly as they watched Liam fight. Her heart screamed in terror. Was she going to lose him again? Was this some kind of cruel joke from fate? The minutes dragged like an eternity, but finally, sirens pierced the cold February air. A pair of paramedics rushed in, pushing through the crowd as they assessed the impossible situation before them. One of them, a tall woman with sharp eyes and steady hands, pressed her fingers to Liam's wrist. "He's got a pulse," she called to her partner. "It's weak, but it's there." They worked quickly, placing an oxygen mask over Liam's mouth, checking his vitals, preparing him for transport. Rachel clutched Amy, whispering, "Daddy's going to be okay. He's going to be okay." But even she wasn't sure if she believed it. As the paramedics lifted Liam onto the stretcher, Amy suddenly broke free from Rachel's grasp. "Daddy." She darted toward him, her small hand reaching out. Liam, barely conscious, turned his head toward her, his eyes struggling to stay open. For a moment, just a fleeting second, their eyes met. Amy placed her tiny hand in his palm, and Liam squeezed. It was weak, barely there, but it was a message, a promise. "I'm here." Rachel hurried forward, pressing a shaky kiss to Liam's forehead. "I love you," she whispered, the tears unstoppable now. Liam's lips barely moved, but she saw it. "Love, you, too." The paramedics rushed him out, and Rachel followed, gripping Amy's hand so tightly it hurt. The funeral guests stood in stunned silence, watching the impossible unfold. Some would later say it was a miracle. Others would claim that Liam had never truly been gone. But Rachel knew the truth. She had felt his cold skin just hours ago. She had kissed his lifeless lips and whispered her goodbye. Liam had died. But somehow, against all logic, all science, all reason, he had come back. And now, as she ran alongside the ambulance, holding Amy close, one thought echoed in her mind. Why? Why had Liam been given a second chance? And at what cost? A man who was never supposed to wake up. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and uncertainty. The walls were a pale shade of blue, designed to be calming, yet they felt sterile and unfeeling. The fluorescent lights above flickered slightly, casting a dull glow over the waiting area where Rachel sat motionless, gripping Amy's tiny hand like a lifeline. Her fingers trembled around the crumpled fabric of her dress. It was still the black mourning gown she had worn to bury her husband. The irony of it made her sick. A few hours ago, she had been preparing to leave the funeral home alone, to go back to an empty house where Liam's scent still clung to the pillows, where his toothbrush was still by the sink, where his old work boots sat by the door waiting for a man who would never step into them again. But now Liam was in surgery, fighting. Again. Her heart clenched painfully. "Mommy." Amy's small voice barely broke the heavy silence in the waiting room. Her fingers tugged weakly at Rachel's sleeve. The little girl had been silent ever since they arrived. But now, in the dim glow of the hospital lights, she looked up at her mother with wide, frightened eyes. Rachel turned to her daughter, her voice hoarse from the hours of crying. "Yes, baby." Amy hesitated, chewing on her lip the way she always did when she was scared. Then, in a soft whisper, she asked, "Is Daddy going to die again?" The question shattered Rachel. She sucked in a breath, but the air felt thick, like she was drowning in a sea of emotions she couldn't process. How was she supposed to answer that? How could she tell her daughter that she had no idea what was happening? That Liam, her father, the man who had already died once today, was fighting for his life again. Instead of answering, Rachel pulled Amy into her arms, holding her so tightly she felt the child's heartbeat against her own. "I don't know, sweetheart," she finally admitted, her voice breaking. "But I pray he doesn't." The words felt like glass in her throat. Amy sniffled, burying her face in her mother's shoulder. "I hugged him, Mommy," she whispered, barely audible. "When everyone else thought he was gone, I hugged him. And he came back." Rachel stiffened. A chill ran down her spine. The words sounded so simple, so innocent, yet they carried a weight that pressed down on her like a storm cloud. Amy had been the one to hold Liam's body when everyone had already said goodbye. She had crawled into his coffin, wrapped her tiny arms around him, and begged him to wake up. And then he did. Rachel swallowed hard, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't make sense of. Could it have been some kind of delayed reaction from his body? A medical mistake? A misdiagnosis? Or was it something more? The thought terrified her. Before she could say another word, the doors to the surgery ward swung open. Rachel shot to her feet so fast that Amy nearly tumbled off her lap. A doctor, dressed in green scrubs, stepped into the waiting area. His face was unreadable, his expression carefully controlled. The kind of look people wore when they were about to deliver life-changing news. Those were the same words Amy had whispered in the funeral home as she hugged his cold body. Liam's hand trembled as he slowly lifted it to his chest, touching the place where his heart should have stopped forever. I felt something pull me back, like a thread unraveling in reverse, like I had no choice but to return. He turned his gaze to Rachel then, his eyes filled with raw emotion. I woke up because of her. Rachel shook her head slowly, unable to process it. "Liam, that doesn't make sense. That's not." But she couldn't finish the sentence, because none of this made sense. Yet here he was, alive, defying death. She turned to look at Amy again, sleeping soundly, unaware of the storm her father's words had unleashed. Could it really be possible? Had their daughter somehow called Liam back from death? Rachel's lips trembled. "Do you think she saved you?" Liam didn't hesitate. "I know she did." A shiver ran down Rachel's spine. She had seen miracles before, small ones, like the day she found out she was pregnant with Amy after years of struggling. Like the time Liam had walked away from a construction accident that should have crushed his ribs. But this was beyond miracles. This was something unexplainable, something otherworldly. Rachel exhaled shakily, pressing a trembling hand to her forehead. "Liam, if that's true, what does it mean?" Liam looked at their daughter, his expression unreadable. "It means Amy isn't just any little girl." The weight of his words sank into Rachel's chest like a stone. She turned back to their daughter, watching the slow rise and fall of her tiny shoulders, the peaceful way she held onto her stuffed bear. She had always been special, hadn't she? From the moment she was born, Amy had been different. She was wise beyond her years, understanding things that no child her age should. She had learned to read by the time she was 3, had a way of knowing when people were sad before they even spoke, and had always been able to bring comfort in a way that felt almost magical. Rachel had brushed it off before, had told herself Amy was just a gifted child. But now she wasn't so sure. And then, as if on cue, Amy stirred. She let out a soft whimper, shifting slightly in her chair, and then her eyes fluttered open. Rachel held her breath. The room was silent. Then, Amy's sleepy gaze drifted toward her father, and just like that, a small smile touched her lips. "Daddy," she whispered softly. Liam's breath hitched, emotion thick in his throat. "Hey, sweetheart." Amy's smile widened, her bright eyes shining with something Rachel could only describe as knowing. Like she had expected this. Like she had never doubted for a second that her father would wake up. Rachel stared at her daughter, a shudder running through her. "Amy," she murmured hesitantly. Do you remember what happened at the funeral?" Amy turned her sleepy gaze to her mother. "And then?" She nodded. Rachel felt the blood drain from her face. Amy yawned, rubbing her eyes before she spoke. "I hugged Daddy," she said simply, as if she were stating the most obvious thing in the world. "And I told him he had to come back." Rachel's breath caught. And how did you know he would?" Amy blinked, tilting her head like the question confused her. Then she said something that sent a chill through Rachel's entire body. "Because he wasn't supposed to leave yet." Rachel's fingers curled into the fabric of her dress, her heartbeat echoing in her ears. "Amy," Liam whispered, his voice tight. "How did you know that?" Amy shrugged casually, as if it wasn't something extraordinary. "Because the lady told me." Rachel's stomach dropped. A sudden, unbearable silence filled the room. Liam's grip on Rachel's hand tightened. Rachel swallowed thickly, her voice barely above a whisper. "What lady?" Amy blinked, as if the answer should have been obvious. "The lady with the white dress," she said softly, innocently. "The one who came to me in my dreams before we went to Daddy's funeral." Rachel's entire body went cold. She couldn't breathe. Amy shifted in her seat, completely unaware of the weight of her words. "She told me Daddy was about to get lost," Amy continued, her voice light and childlike. "But that if I held him tight enough and told him to come back, he might listen." Rachel stared at her daughter in complete shock. Her mind screamed for logic, for reason, for anything that could explain this. But there was nothing. And deep down, in the darkest part of her soul, she knew. She knew Amy had seen something. And whatever it was, it had changed everything. The truth beyond life and death. Rachel didn't sleep that night. She sat beside Liam's hospital bed, staring at Amy as she dozed in the chair, her small chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm. But there was nothing peaceful inside Rachel. Her mind spun in endless circles, replaying her daughter's words over and over again. "Because he wasn't supposed to leave yet. The lady told me. She came to me in my dreams before we went to Daddy's funeral." Rachel shivered. Something had happened. Something she couldn't explain. Something Amy understood in a way that no 6-year-old should. And Liam. He had seen Amy when he was gone. He had heard her voice pulling him back. Rachel glanced at her husband, his face still pale but peaceful in sleep, his breath steady, his body slowly regaining strength. He should have been dead, but he wasn't. And somehow, deep in her bones, Rachel knew. Amy had saved him. But how? And who was the woman in white? Rachel didn't realize she was gripping Liam's hand until his fingers twitched slightly under hers. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open, and the moment his gaze met hers, he gave her a small, tired smile. "Still here," he murmured weakly. Rachel let out a breath she didn't know she was holding, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Yeah," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "You are." Liam's gaze softened. He knew what she was thinking. "I felt it, Rachel," he whispered. "I felt myself leaving. I don't know where I was, but I was somewhere. And I heard her. Amy." Her voice was like an anchor, like something pulling me back. He swallowed hard. "I fought to come back, because I couldn't leave her. I couldn't leave you." Rachel pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, swallowing the sob that threatened to escape. "I believe you," she whispered. Liam's eyes searched hers. "Do you believe that, Amy?" Rachel slowly nodded. She did. She had to. There was no other explanation for what had happened. Their daughter had done something no one else could. And Rachel had to find out why. A child's gift. The next morning, As the sun painted the hospital walls in soft gold, Amy woke up stretching her tiny arms with a sleepy yawn. She blinked a few times before her gaze landed on Liam. Her entire face lit up. "Daddy," she squealed, scrambling out of the chair and running to the hospital bed. Liam smiled weakly as she climbed up beside him, wrapping her little arms around his waist as if she never wanted to let go again. Rachel sat at the edge of the bed, watching them with awe and something close to fear. She didn't want to be afraid of her daughter, but something inside her whispered that Amy wasn't just an ordinary child. And it was time to find out what that meant. "Amy," Rachel said softly, tucking a strand of hair behind her daughter's ear. "Can you tell me more about the lady in white?" Amy tilted her head. "You believe me." Rachel's heart ached. She cupped Amy's small face in her hands, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Of course I do, baby." Amy's lips curled into a soft smile before she turned her gaze toward the window, as if looking for something no one else could see. "She was very pretty," Amy said after a moment. She had long, shiny hair, and her dress was white like the clouds. "She didn't talk a lot, but she smiled at me. She told me Daddy was about to go somewhere far away, but that if I really, really wanted him to stay, I had to hold him tight and tell him to come back." Rachel shuddered. "And you weren't scared?" Amy shook her head. "No, she was nice. She smelled like flowers." Liam and Rachel exchanged a glance. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then, Amy reached into her pocket and pulled out a small silver locket. Rachel's breath hitched. It was Liam's mother's locket, the one he had lost years ago, the one that had vanished after his mother passed away. Rachel's hands shook as she took it from Amy, flipping it open. Inside was an old photograph. A woman with long, dark hair and soft eyes, wearing a white dress. Rachel's throat closed. "Liam," she whispered, her voice cracking. Liam stared at the picture for a long time, his eyes dark with emotion. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "That's my mother." Rachel felt her world tip sideways. That's the woman Amy saw." Amy nodded, swinging her legs as if this was the most normal thing in the world. Liam's hands clenched into fists. His mother had died before Amy was born. Amy had never seen her, had never even heard stories about her. So how did she know? How did she have the locket? Rachel couldn't breathe. This wasn't just a coincidence. This wasn't just a misdiagnosis, a mistake. Liam had died. He had left. And Amy, with the help of someone beyond this world, had brought him back. Rachel's fingers trembled as she looked at her daughter, her heart hammering in her chest. "Amy, sweetheart," she whispered, "do you know what you did?" Amy smiled. And then, she placed her tiny hand over her father's heart. A warmth filled the room, something Rachel couldn't describe. "I just made sure Daddy wasn't lonely," Amy said simply. Her voice was soft, innocent, like she had done nothing extraordinary. Like bringing back the dead was something she had always known how to do. Rachel felt tears slip down her cheeks. Because deep down, she knew the truth now. Amy wasn't just their daughter. She was something more. A gift. A miracle. A child with a connection to something far beyond life and death. And as Rachel looked at Liam, who was still alive because of their little girl, she realized some questions weren't meant to be answered. Some mysteries weren't meant to be understood. Because sometimes, the impossible just happened. And when it did, you held on to it with everything you had. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.